Under the sprawling, decaying branches of an old elm tree, three identical boys once vanished without a trace. A moment before, their joyful laughter had filled the yard, bringing it to life. The next moment, absolute silence fell upon the street. Not a single clue remained. No tire tracks, no damaged fence, not even the slightest imprint of a child's foot on the soft earth. After this tragic event, the house itself seemed to freeze in time. Neighbors, gripped by an inexplicable fear, hastily abandoned their homes. The house's windows remained impenetrably dark, as if concealing something sinister. For 3 decades, the place carefully guarded its dark secrets. No answers were found, no bodies, only an unbearable memory, sealed within its walls, until something inexplicable happened last night. The lights in the house began to flicker spontaneously, and someone distinctly heard children's voices coming from the attic. These voices, it was known, had not been heard since distant 1982. The early June sun generously illuminated the cracked sidewalks of Maplewood Drive with a golden glow. A heat haze shimmered above the scorching asphalt, subtly distorting the familiar outlines of reality, making the entire street seem both abandoned and silently watchful. At the very end of this cul-de-sac, as if cut off from the world, stood house number 214. Its tightly shuttered windows and peeling paint gave the structure the appearance of a deeply weary, forgotten home, one that seemed to have been untouched by human interaction for a very, very long time. Jake Johnson, wiping his brow with the edge of his shirt to clear the accumulating sweat, forcefully pressed a crowbar into the corner of the garage wall. The old plywood, warped by time, felt incredibly fragile under his hand, but behind it, beyond a layer of drywall, something was clearly amiss. "Why is there framing here where there absolutely shouldn't be?" he muttered, speaking more to himself than to his wife, who was methodically unpacking boxes on the driveway. Olivia Johnson looked up from an old crate filled with dusty gardening tools. "What did you say? This whole section of the garage? That's really strange. It looks like someone intentionally walled off part of the wall and never finished the framing." She walked closer, hands on her hips, and asked with a touch of irony, "Are you saying we're about to discover hidden treasure? Or maybe a whole family of raccoons?" Jake chuckled, though with a hint of caution. "I hope not the latter," he replied. With a dull but satisfying crack, the crowbar tore off a sizable piece of drywall, instantly revealing an empty space behind it. In the beam of sunlight filtering through a small garage window, swirls of dust danced, creating an almost mystical atmosphere. And that's when they saw it. Between the wooden studs and an old concrete slab, in a space barely 90 centimeters deep, a wooden box was tightly wedged. Time had mercilessly turned its wood a lifeless gray, and the iron hinges had taken on a deep, brittle reddish hue. On top, in faded permanent marker, a child's name was carelessly scrawled, Ethan. Olivia caught her breath in sudden shock. "What the hell is this?" she gasped. Jake knelt, carefully brushing away cobwebs. "This isn't good at all," he murmured. The box wasn't locked, merely sealed with old nails that had long since loosened with age. With slow, almost hesitant fingers, Jake lifted the lid. Inside, thick dust clung to the items like ash, items that absolutely did not belong here. Not in a boarded-up corner of a garage, not left like this, not forgotten. There lay a toy fire truck missing its wheels, several tangled yo-yos, a laminated school library card with the name Owen Bennett written in large letters, a red and blue spiral notebook filled with inverted letters and funny stick figures, and at the very bottom, a faded Polaroid picture. Olivia carefully picked up the photograph, as if afraid it might crumble in her hands. "Oh my God," she exclaimed. In the picture, 3 boys, identical in appearance, smiled broadly at the camera, dressed in matching red jackets. Their arms were wrapped tightly around each other, symbolizing an unbreakable bond. Behind them, unmistakably, stood this very house, its porch railing still retaining its distinctive curve. The same siding, the same cracked sidewalk leading to the front steps, all testified to the unchanging nature of the place. Olivia carefully flipped the photograph over, but there was no date or names on the back. Jake slowly stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans, and thoughtfully said, "Triplets, I suppose." A long, meaningful pause hung between them, and something cold, despite the external heat, crept into their minds. Olivia walked out of the garage, clutching the Polaroid picture tightly in her hand. She pulled out her phone and frantically typed into the search engine, "Triplets missing Maplewood Drive." The result was immediate. Information about missing children, dated 1989, instantly appeared on the screen. Ethan, Owen, and Mason Bennett, 7-year-old boys, were last seen returning home on their bicycles from school in Rosewood County, Ohio. The article included photos where their faces were clearly visible. Jake, appearing beside her, read over her shoulder. "They disappeared from this street," he said with a note of shock. Olivia slowly nodded. "I think they lived right across the street," she added. Together, they turned, looking at the quiet, tree-lined street. A modest brick house stood directly opposite their driveway, its lawn slightly overgrown, and its porch shaded by a creaky awning. A light breeze swept through the trees, lifting dry leaves along the sidewalk, like the whisper of long-forgotten memories. The house looked absolutely still, frozen in time. Jake was the first to break the silence. "We need to report this," he stated decisively. Of course, Olivia agreed, but her voice had noticeably changed. There was something tender in it now, a softness akin to deep sadness. She looked at the photograph again, at these little boys, smiling, carefree, still alive in that single captured moment, frozen in a moment someone had desperately tried to hide. The police arrived by the end of the day. 2 patrol cars and 1 detective in an ill-fitting jacket. They methodically photographed the found items, carefully bagging everything in plastic, wearing gloves, and asking questions in a clipped, procedural tone. "This case is cold as Antarctica," one of the officers muttered, zipping up a plastic evidence bag. "Closed since '94. No leads for over 20 years. Detective Sarah Jenkins was polite, efficient, and showed no interest in speculation. "We'll log the evidence, reopen the case, and continue the investigation if anything new comes up," she said, handing Olivia a business card. "But don't expect a miracle. These boys disappeared 35 years ago." Jake nodded respectfully, but Olivia lingered, her gaze fixed on the wall, on the spot where the box had once been, hidden behind insulation and studs. Who put it there? Why those specific items? Why this particular house? After the officers left, Jake began patching up the wall again. Olivia didn't help. She simply stood on the driveway, looking across the street. A light came on the porch of the brick house opposite. A figure sat quietly in a rocking chair. She hadn't noticed him before. That evening, as twilight slowly dissolved into soft orange light over the rooftops, Olivia reopened the missing persons article. She carefully read every word, every paragraph. She learned their names: Ethan, Owen, and Mason Bennett, 7 years old. They were last seen near the corner of Maplewood Drive and Oak Street at 4:12 p.m. A neighbor claimed they were riding their bikes and laughing cheerfully. Another witness stated they hadn't returned home from school at all. The case was initially classified as a non-suspicious disappearance, and then, after some time, reclassified as a presumed abduction. Their mother was quoted in a 1990 newspaper. She still resided in town and had never moved away. "I just want someone to remember their faces," she had said. "They didn't just disappear. Someone made them disappear." Olivia closed her laptop. The photograph lay beside her on the nightstand. In it, the middle boy, Owen, had a noticeable gap between his front teeth. Mason's jeans had grass stains, as if he had just been playing on the lawn. Ethan, standing in the middle, held a bent stick like a sword, ready for adventure. They looked alive, full of energy. And now they were just ghosts, found in her garage. The next morning, Olivia resolutely walked across the street. The woman who opened the door was, of course, significantly older than in the photographs. Her hair, touched with gray at the temples, spoke of years lived, but her eyes remained the same, sharp, observant, and yet tender, with that particular softness born only from the deepest grief, which folds in on itself, becoming part of the soul. "Yes," she said, looking through the screen door. "Eleanor Bennett?" Olivia asked. The woman hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "My name is Olivia Johnson. My husband and I just bought the house across the street." Eleanor's expression remained unchanged. "We were renovating," Olivia continued, her voice trembling slightly. "And we discovered some things. A box hidden behind the wall in the garage." Eleanor remained silent. "Inside were children's things," Olivia said, "and a photograph of 3 boys." Eleanor now pulled open the screen door. "You should come in," she said softly. The living room was dim but impeccably clean. A fan slowly rotated overhead, creating a gentle draft. The floral wallpaper had slightly peeled in one corner, betraying the house's age. On the mantelpiece stood 3 identical silver frames, one for each son. Each held the same school portrait, a round face, dark eyes, identical toothy smiles. Time had not been kind to the prints. The colors had faded, but the faces remained recognizable. Eleanor sat opposite Olivia, her hands folded in her lap. "May I see?" she asked. Olivia reached into her bag and took out the Polaroid picture. Eleanor took it with steady hands. Her face at first remained unchanged, only a long silence that seemed to stretch across the room. Her eyes scanned the photograph again and again, as if the boys might say something new if she looked long enough. "This was the day before," she whispered. "That's Mason in front. He always stood like that." "And Ethan," her voice trembled, but she continued. "He picked out these jackets. They said red was their superhero color." She ran her thumb over the edge of the photograph, as if she could draw warmth from its touch. "I had this exact same photo. I thought it was lost." "It was behind the wall," Olivia said softly, "in a box with some of their things." Eleanor looked up. "In that house?" Olivia nodded. Eleanor closed her eyes. "For years I walked past that house, trying to remember who lived there. I never thought to check it after Walter Thompson died." "Walter Thompson," Olivia repeated. "He was the man who lived there then. An elderly gentleman, mostly kept to himself, lost his wife before we moved in." Olivia felt her pulse quicken. "Was he ever investigated?" "No," Eleanor said softly. "He had an alibi, and he was respected." She stared at the photograph again. "But I always wondered. He had a dog, Brutus. My boys loved that dog. Sometimes I saw them petting it on the sidewalk, even though I warned them not to talk to strangers." She looked up sharply with a calm clarity that sent a shiver down Olivia's spine. "Mrs. Johnson, that wall was sealed deliberately. Those items weren't forgotten. They were hidden." Eleanor Bennett didn't sleep that night. She left the photograph on her nightstand, face up, staring at the ceiling. Her hand constantly reached for it in the dark, her fingers tracing its edges, as if it were a coal she could rekindle with a touch. The boys' smiles haunted her in a way they hadn't in years. Not because they had disappeared, but because for the first time in 3 decades, she was no longer so sure they had disappeared. At 3:17 a.m., she walked barefoot into the backyard garden. She had stopped planting flowers many years ago, after the roses failed to bloom on the day the boys would have turned 10. Now, it was mostly weeds and stubborn remnants of lilies that refused to die, no matter how much she ignored them. She knelt in the dirt and placed the photograph beside her. "I told everyone," she whispered. "They weren't just lost." The wind rustled the fence. In the distance, a dog barked faintly. Eleanor stood up and, for the first time in 15 years, began pulling weeds from the ground. By mid-morning, Olivia and Jake were back inside house number 214. They were still in a daze from what they had discovered. The house now felt different, as if it had grown heavier, filled with an invisible weight. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes seemed like a whisper left by people who should never have been forgotten. They sat in the dining room, coffee mugs untouched before them. "We have to help her," Olivia said softly. Jake exhaled heavily. "I just don't know how. We turned everything over to the police. What else can we do? We can't pretend we didn't find this," she said, her eyes gesturing toward the garage. "You saw her face. That photo was taken here. There's something in this house that no one ever looked at closely enough." Jake rubbed his jaw, considering her words. "So we could look into Walter Thompson, find out who he was, what happened to him." "I already did," Olivia said. She turned her laptop toward him. "Died in 2002 of a stroke, no children. Not much information on him, but I found his will." Jake raised an eyebrow, surprised. "His will?" She nodded. "Filed in Rosewood County Court. It's a public record. He left the house to a niece, an Emily Carter. She sold it 5 years later to a rental company, who then left it vacant until we bought it." "So Emily Carter might know something," Jake suggested. "She's no longer in Ohio," Olivia said. "Moved to Maine in 2008, but I'm going to call her." Jake looked at her doubtfully. "Are we sure this is something we should be doing? I mean, this is the police's job, right? They had that job 35 years ago, and they found nothing," Olivia said more sharply than she intended. "If it were our kids." Jake raised a hand, cutting her off. "Okay, you're right." Clouds began to gather outside, turning the bright morning sun into a flat gray light. Eleanor returned to the Johnson house that afternoon, her fingers stained with earth, the photograph still clutched tightly in one hand. She knocked once and waited patiently. Her composure had returned. She was calm, attentive, almost regal in her restraint. But Olivia noticed how tightly she gripped the photograph. "Come in," Olivia said, stepping aside, inviting her inside. Eleanor's eyes scanned the house as she entered. The walls, The lighting, the hallway, it was muscle memory, searching for details. She had imagined this space for so long. Find anything else? Eleanor asked softly. Just the box, Olivia said. A few toys, school papers, in the room itself. It was sealed off. Jake nodded. 2x4s and multiple layers of drywall. Nothing fancy, but it was deliberate. Eleanor looked around again. Did he have a dog? She asked. Jake blinked, clearly confused by the question. What? Walter Thompson? Did you find any evidence of a dog? Teeth marks, claw scratches, dog bowls, anything? No, Olivia said, frowning. Why? Eleanor turned to the window and slightly pulled back the curtain, looking into the yard. My boys loved his dog, she murmured. A big retriever. They'd pet him on their way home from school, talk to him through the fence. I warned them about strangers, but a dog like that, it lowers your guard. You think the dog was used to lure them? Olivia asked. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Then she slowly nodded. I think it started with the dog, then kindness, then trust. That evening, Olivia called the Rosewood County Archives and requested a copy of Walter Thompson's property plans. She was surprised when the clerk said, Funny, you're not the first to ask for those. Someone came in last year. Do you remember who? Olivia asked. The clerk hesitated. No name, just some guy. Wanted the garage blueprints for a restoration project. Paid cash for the printouts. Olivia wrote something down. Are there any records of who was Thompson's caregiver before he died? She asked. Probably in his medical records. I'd have to check if that's public. Olivia hung up with more questions than answers. Later that night, when the house was quiet and Jake was asleep, she sat on the living room floor with a flashlight, examining every inch of the remaining garage wall. Right at the baseboard, behind the shelves, she discovered something barely visible, a small scuff mark, pale gray on the wood, almost gone with time. Olivia leaned closer, and then it became clear it wasn't just a scuff. It was a name, scratched in with a nail or some sharp object. Owen. Eleanor stood in her kitchen early the next morning, brewing tea in a chipped mug. Outside the window, the garden was freshly tilled for the first time in decades. She still hadn't planted anything, but she was going to. For the first time in years, she had an intention to do something. A soft knock at her door made her jump. Opening it, she saw Detective Sarah Jenkins standing on the porch, her jacket rumpled from the morning damp, her eyes cautious but kind. Mrs. Bennett, she said, I'd like to talk. Eleanor held the door open, inviting her in. They sat at the kitchen table, tea for one, silence for both. I've seen the photos, Jenkins said. And the evidence from the Johnson house, the boys' things, the Polaroid, and now the new markings found in the wall. Eleanor raised her eyebrows, a challenge in her gaze. So, you believe me now? Jenkins sighed. I believe something happened in that house. What exactly? I don't know yet. Eleanor folded her hands on the table. Walter Thompson. He wasn't just a grieving old man. There's something more there. We've reopened the case, Jenkins said, unofficially. Cold cases don't always get a lot of attention, but there's enough here to warrant a search warrant for the property. I've already searched it, Eleanor said softly. For years in my head, over and over. Jenkins looked at her notes. You said the boys were last seen on their bikes. Were they ever found? Eleanor's eyes hardened. No. The bikes disappeared with them. Jenkins slowly nodded. Then I want to dig under the garage, under the foundation, if necessary. Eleanor blinked, surprised by the statement. Why? Because in 2001, Jenkins said, a similar disappearance happened 2 towns over. Another old man, another child never found. That man also died of a stroke. And guess what we found in his garage last year? Eleanor leaned forward, anticipating the answer. A pair of shoes, child-sized, buried in the concrete under the water heater. The next day, building permits were fast-tracked. Jenkins brought in a forensic team under the guise of a structural inspection. The Johnsons agreed to allow the excavation. A slab of concrete was removed near the back corner of the garage. At first, they found nothing. Then, just below the earth, wrapped in plastic sheeting and old fabric, they uncovered a crumpled lunchbox, red metal, heavily rusted. Inside were a pair of socks, a Pokemon sticker, and a folded note that read, Please don't tell Mom I took the dog treats. Owen. Eleanor sat on the front steps, holding the lunchbox in both hands, as if it were a living thing. The sun set behind her, casting golden light through the trees of Maplewood Drive. For the first time in 35 years, the street seemed to breathe again. Eleanor stood at the edge of the Johnsons' garage, The earth still excavated where the forensic team had stopped, the outlines of the foundation cracked and incomplete. In her gloved hands, she held the lunchbox again, lighter than she remembered, as if memory had added weight over time. It had once been red like a fire truck. Ethan's favorite color. She remembered Owen begging for the same one at the store so he could be like him. But this one, she was sure, belonged to Mason. He was always quiet, the one who didn't fight for attention, but left notes everywhere. She slowly turned it in her hands. It smelled of rust, dust, and old apples. Olivia stood nearby, watching her carefully. "Do you want to sit down?" she asked softly. Eleanor shook her head. "If I sit, I might fall apart." Later that day, Detective Jenkins returned with 2 small evidence bags. One contained a faded Pokemon sticker. The other, a folded note. Eleanor looked at it through the plastic. "Please don't tell Mom I took the dog treats. Owen." It was written in red crayon. The letters were uneven, slanted, as if a hurried hand had rushed to capture a thought. Owen was always hasty, always scribbling without care for calligraphy. "It's real," Eleanor said, her voice barely audible, filled with deep emotion. "It's his." Jenkins gave her a minute before speaking, allowing the moment to settle. "We're going to bring in ground-penetrating radar. Scan the entire yard, under the house, adjacent properties." Eleanor nodded, her gaze focused. "You think they're buried?" "I think someone hid something," Jenkins said, her tone serious. "And when people hide something, it's because they don't want it found." The next day, Eleanor brought a small box down from her attic. It was unmarked, tucked between 2 boxes of Christmas decorations and old tax documents, as if a keeper of long-forgotten secrets. Inside were dozens of photographs, neatly sorted by year. The boys' lives, captured on film, birthdays, bike rides, first days of school. 3 almost identical faces. And yet, to her, they were always different. She spread them out on the kitchen table. One by one. Ethan, always smiling a little too wide, his hair sticking up no matter what she did. Owen, a little taller than the rest, always with dirt on his knees, quick to argue, quicker to hug. Mason, quiet, sweet, a thinker, his favorite thing to do was read comic books upside down. She stared at the last photograph, taken 2 weeks before they disappeared. All 3 stood in the driveway, helmets on, bikes ready, smiles as wide as Texas. A gust of wind ruffled the edge of the photo. Her eyes narrowed. In the far background, barely discernible behind the trees, was the corner of Walter Thompson's house. And next to it, unmistakably, the tall silhouette of Brutus, the golden retriever, and just behind him, half hidden by a porch pillar, the figure of a man, thin, in a pale shirt, standing perfectly still. Eleanor picked up the photograph, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never noticed it before. Meanwhile, Olivia was on the phone with the Rosewood County Clerk's office. "Yes, I'm still trying to track down records of Walter Thompson's next of kin. Any caregivers, medical professionals, hospice workers, anything." She paused while the woman on the other end typed. "There's a record," the clerk said. "A man named Ralph Miller, listed as a part-time aide for the last 6 months before Walter Thompson's stroke. No official license on file, which is odd." Olivia's pen froze. "Do you have an address?" "Only a P.O. box. It's outdated." Olivia wrote it down anyway. "Anything else unusual?" she asked. "Well, I'm not sure if it matters, but Mr. Thompson's death certificate had a discrepancy. He was pronounced dead at home by a neighbor, but the coroner noted signs of a previous fall that likely occurred days before the stroke. Was that investigated?" "Natural causes were listed. No autopsy was performed." Olivia thanked her and hung up. "Ralph Miller," she murmured to herself. The name felt empty, devoid of any meaning. That evening, Olivia went across the street again. Eleanor opened the door, holding the photograph with the blurred figure in the background. "I think this is him," she said without preamble. "Walter and Brutus, and maybe someone else." Olivia looked closely. "Are those your boys on their bikes?" Eleanor nodded. "The morning they disappeared." Olivia hesitated. "I found a name. Ralph Miller. He was Walter's aide for the month before he died." Eleanor's eyes darted to her, dark and wide. "Was he investigated?" No one mentioned him in the initial report." They sat at Eleanor's dining table. Olivia spread out the documents she had gathered. Eleanor laid out the photographs. Piece by piece, they were building something. A shape, a pattern, perhaps even the truth. The next morning, the ground-penetrating radar team arrived at the Johnson property. The long, thin equipment scanned the yard, the garage, and the concrete slabs near the foundation. Jake watched from the front steps, arms crossed, the tension evident in how he silently bounced his foot against the railing. Detective Jenkins stood at the garage entrance, carefully reviewing the scans as they loaded. One of the technicians suddenly froze, his gaze fixed on the screen. "Ma'am," he said. Jenkins stepped forward. "What is it?" "There's a void detected under the back corner of the foundation, approximately 5 by 3 feet, an unnatural shape. It doesn't match any plumbing plans or known structural features. 4 feet deep. Could be a crawl space. Could be a sealed pit." Jenkins' jaw tightened. "Mark it," she said, "and bring in the excavator." Eleanor waited on the sidewalk, her hands clasped tightly, her gardening gloves forgotten in her pockets. The digging took hours. Olivia joined her, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the work site. At 4:17 p.m., the excavator operator shut down the engine. The crew began digging by hand. Minutes passed, feeling like an eternity. Then a shout. "Found something." Everyone rushed forward. A bundle, wrapped in plastic. 3 more in total. But when the packages were carefully, respectfully opened, they did not contain bodies. They contained bicycles. 3 small, rusted children's bicycles, still intact, still brightly colored, faded by time, each with a laminated tag tied to the handlebars. "Ethan, Owen, Mason." Eleanor covered her mouth with both hands, her knees buckled, and Olivia caught her before she fell. "They were here," Eleanor whispered. "They were here." Detective Jenkins knelt beside the bikes, examining the name tags. "They buried the bikes," she murmured. "But not the boys." That night, Eleanor sat on her porch, clutching the photograph of her sons in one hand, the red lunchbox beside her. "I always said," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They didn't just disappear." Across the street, the light in the garage flickered once and went out. She didn't move. The wind rustled the leaves of her overgrown garden, and for the first time in years, it didn't sound like silence. It sounded like breathing, like the house exhaling, like something long buried beginning to rise. It started with Brutus. Eleanor hadn't spoken the dog's name in years, not since a faded memory surfaced one sleepless night. A flash of laughing boys. All 3 pressed against the golden retriever, as if a secret pact of fur and slobber had been struck between them. Ethan insisted the dog loved him most, but it was Mason who carried dog treats in his pockets, the good, bacon-shaped ones. They loved that dog most on the way home from school, perhaps even more than they feared what their mother told them. Never follow strangers, even if they have a dog. The discovery of the bicycles was front-page news the next morning. Headlines screamed, "Breakthrough in 1989 triplets disappearance. Bikes found buried in suburban garage." Eleanor didn't read the article. The photograph spoke enough. A blurred shot of the rusted bicycles laid out on a tarp. Their plastic name tags dangled, faded by time, but unmistakable. Even the colors of the bikes remained, vibrant. Blue, red, and yellow. Ethan, Owen, and Mason. Jake and Olivia tried to stay out of the spotlight. Reporters called their house, knocked on their door, even staked out their driveway, hoping for a quote, but Olivia always said the same thing. "We just want answers for Eleanor." Detective Jenkins arrived early that afternoon. She parked down the street and walked up to Eleanor's porch, a notepad in one hand and a photograph in the other. "I found this among Walter Thompson's personal effects at the county storage facility," she said, handing over the picture. "Taken about a year before your boys disappeared. That's Brutus, right?" Eleanor looked down. The dog stared out from the photo, tongue lolling, eyes wide and trusting. It sat obediently beside Thompson, who held a leash in one hand and a plastic grocery bag in the other. "That's him," Eleanor confirmed softly. "Same spots on his ears." According to veterinary records, Jenkins continued, "Brutus was euthanized the same month your boys disappeared. The paperwork said he was aggressive." Eleanor's brows furrowed in confusion. "Aggressive? He never bit anyone before." "Right." "No," Eleanor said, shaking her head decisively. "Never." "That's what I thought," Jenkins murmured, her gaze thoughtful. "I think the dog saw something or reacted to something, and someone wanted him silenced." Eleanor gripped the photograph tighter, her voice filled with resolve. "But they didn't silence my boys. Not completely." That night, Olivia was back in the newspaper archives, searching for something she might have missed. A name, a thread, a pattern. She found a 1990 obituary for Walter Thompson's wife, Hazel Thompson, and a strange note, buried in a column, preceded in death by her son, Theodore, age 3. Olivia sat up straight, her attention fully captured by that line. Thompson had a son. The article offered no details, no date of the child's death, no costs. Just a single line, as if someone didn't want to talk about it. She dug deeper, cross-referencing county birth and death records. Theodore Thompson, born 1957, died 1960. Cause of death, accidental drowning. No more information, but that was the year Thompson stopped teaching. Olivia wrote the name down and circled it. Eleanor returned to the Johnson house the next morning. Olivia met her at the door with coffee and tired eyes, evidence of a sleepless night. "I found something," she said. They sat at the dining room table again, the same spot where they had first passed the Polaroid back and forth. This time, Olivia handed her a printout of the obituary. Eleanor read it twice, her face showing deep shock. "Why did he keep it a secret?" she asked. "Why didn't he mention his son?" "Maybe he lost more than just a child that day," Olivia said. "Maybe it broke something in him." Eleanor traced her finger over Theodore's name. "Or maybe he wanted another chance," she whispered. Olivia looked at her sharply. "You think that's why he took them?" Eleanor's eyes were calm, but held a chilling clarity. 3 boys, all the same age his son would have been, all in one place. He didn't just want a child. He wanted a replacement. Olivia swallowed, feeling a shiver run down her spine. "Then what happened to them?" Eleanor shook her head. "I don't know, but I don't think he acted alone." Detective Jenkins' investigation was progressing. She tracked down hospice records for the last year of Thompson's life. Sparse, but enough to corroborate what Olivia had found. Ralph Miller was a caregiver for several elderly patients in the area, but had never applied for a license, and no one seemed to know where he came from. Jenkins got a break when a bank flagged an inactive safety deposit box registered to Miller, accessed once in 2003, then never again. The box was in Larchmont. Jenkins obtained a warrant. Inside the box were a driver's license for a Harold Moss, several expired passports under different names, 1 photograph. 3 boys sat on a wooden bench. They were facing away from the camera, but the shape of their heads, the curve of their shoulders, it was them. And the photo was dated July 18, 1990, 10 months after they disappeared. Eleanor stared at the photograph for a long time, her eyes filled with mixed emotions. "I knew it," she said, her voice barely audible. Jake leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, looking at the photo over her shoulder. "They were alive." Jenkins nodded. "At least for a while." Olivia asked quietly, "But where were they taken?" "We traced the watermark on the photo," Jenkins said. "It was printed in Arizona, a small-town lab that closed decades ago. It's not much, but it's a lead." Eleanor's voice suddenly became firm, filled with resolve. "Then I'm going." Jenkins hesitated, her face showing concern. "It's not safe." "I don't care," Eleanor interrupted, her voice unyielding. "If someone out there knows what happened to my boys, I'm not sitting here while you ask questions. I've sat long enough." Silence fell, broken only by a faint hum. Then Jenkins nodded, accepting her decision. "I'll drive you." Jake looked at Olivia, waiting for her reaction. "What about us?" Olivia met Eleanor's gaze, and in her eyes was the same determination. "We're going too." That evening, Eleanor returned home alone. She stood in her bedroom and opened a drawer where she kept the boys' last birthday cards, folded construction paper covered in marker hearts, rockets, and scrawled writing. She ran her hand gently over them, then reached behind the drawer and pulled out something no one knew about. She had kept a lock of hair, 3 actually, 1 from each of her sons, taped inside an envelope marked only with a date, March 12, 1989. She had cut them after a particularly chaotic bath night. The boys had laughed so hard that Mason got soap in his ear and started crying until Ethan farted in the tub and made everyone laugh again. Eleanor smiled at the memory. Then she packed the envelope. If they found anything in Arizona, she wanted the DNA ready. Back at house number 214, Olivia went into the garage one more time before bed. She turned on the light. The patched section of the wall was now indistinguishable from the rest, but she could still feel where the secret had once been held. The bikes, the lunchbox, Owen's name carved into the wood. She walked over and placed her hand on the wall. Beneath the paint, there was something she hadn't noticed before. A faint outline, like a faded crayon mark. She stepped back and grabbed her flashlight. At the right angle of light, a shape emerged. It was a crude drawing, a stick figure, then 3 more. Beside them, a dog and a tall figure behind. Underneath it all, in shaky letters, was written, "We can't go." The drive to Arizona was long and mostly silent. Eleanor sat in the back seat, the envelope with the boys' hair samples tucked into her purse, which she clutched like a lifeline. Detective Jenkins drove, her eyes calm, constantly scanning the road, as if she didn't trust it to stay still. Olivia sat in the front seat, her notepad on her lap full of questions. They spoke little, only when necessary: hotel bookings, gas stops, sunset times. But the silence wasn't awkward. It was expectant, like a breath yet to be released. It was late evening when they arrived in Pine Ridge, a desolate town near the Arizona border. Old signs hung from faded poles, and pickup trucks lined the streets outside closed diners. The kind of place with one gas station and two churches across from each other. Jenkins pulled up to a building with faded paint and a cracked wooden sign. Tanner's photo lab closed. "This is it," she said, where the boy's photo was printed. Eleanor slowly opened the door, as if the ground might give way. Inside, the shop was dusty, untouched for years. A "for rent" sign hung crookedly in the front window. Jenkins had arranged access beforehand with the property owner, who met them there. An elderly man in work boots and a trucker hat looked like he hadn't shaved since the photo lab closed. "I used to come here with my daughter for school pictures," he said. Tanner was a quiet guy. Nice, but strange. "Do you remember him having clients who paid in cash?" Jenkins asked. The man nodded. "Pretty much everyone. That was before card readers and apps." "Do you remember anyone printing photos of children around 1990? He thought for a moment. "Can't say. But there was one guy who came in a few times over a couple of years. Always alone. Always with the same old camera. One of those bulky black ones." "Do you remember what he looked like?" "Thin, white, tall, sometimes a beard, sometimes clean-shaven, eyes like he hadn't slept." "Ralph Miller?" Jenkins asked. The man's brows furrowed. "That name sounds right. Why?" Jenkins showed him a copy of the passport photo from the safety deposit box. The man slowly nodded. "Yeah, that's him. He didn't say much, but he always had pictures of kids. Said he worked at a camp." "What kind of camp?" "Didn't say, just that he kept them off the streets." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her face showing deep shock. That evening at the motel, Jenkins laid out the evidence on the bed: the boy's photograph, the fake IDs, the envelope with the DNA samples. "I've contacted the nearest forensics department," she said. "We're sending the photo for timeline analysis. In the meantime, there's another lead. A property registered to one of Miller's aliases, Harold Moss, just outside of town." "What kind of property?" Olivia asked. "A trailer, rural. No utilities registered, but someone pays the land tax and cash annually." Eleanor looked up sharply, her eyes filled with determination. "We're going." The trailer sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by thick brush and a rusty fence. A mailbox stood bent at the gate, the name scratched out with black marker. The place was quiet, not abandoned, but waiting, as if holding its secrets. Jenkins went first, hand on her badge. Olivia followed, carrying a flashlight. Eleanor stayed close, examining every detail: tire tracks, footprints in the dust, a curtain swaying in the window. They knocked. No answer. Jenkins tried the door. Unlocked. Inside, the air was stale, heavy. Dust covered every surface. A double bed with thin sheets, a table, a kettle, a shoebox on the counter marked in black ink as spring. Jenkins carefully opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all boys, some older, some younger, some smiling, some blurred. All of them outside on porches, in parks, and fields. Always in threes, but never facing the camera. Olivia's voice trembled. "Is it them?" Eleanor stepped forward. She picked up one photo. 3 boys sat in a circle, backs to the camera, drawing something on the ground. "I recognize those shoulders," she whispered. "Even in black and white." Jenkins took the box and began photographing everything. They searched every corner of the trailer, cabinets, drawers, and old pantry. Nothing, except for the back room. It had once been a laundry room. The floor had been redone with plywood. A single bare light bulb hung from the ceiling. Something about it felt wrong. Eleanor stood in the doorway, still, her gaze fixed on the floor. "There's something under us," she said. Olivia shined her flashlight on the floor. A faint seam ran across the plywood. Not natural aging. Cut edges. Something had been opened or hidden here. They found a crowbar in the tool shed outside. The plywood came up with a struggle, revealing an empty space beneath the floor, shallow, maybe 3 feet deep, lined with insulation and old fabric, and in the center, a locked metal box. Jenkins slowly pulled it out. The lock was rusted but broke with effort. Inside were 2 journals, tied with twine, a child's drawing, 3 stick figures and a dog, 1 stick figure with excess for eyes, and an envelope labeled Bennett Boys. Eleanor opened it. Inside were 3 small bracelets made of faded plastic beads, the kind you buy at cheap stores, each with a name written in clumsy letters. Ethan, Owen, Mason. Eleanor knelt. "They kept them," she whispered. "They kept their names." That night, Jenkins read the journals. They were written not by Walter Thompson, but by Ralph Miller. The first entry was dated September 22nd, 1989, 2 weeks after the boys disappeared. They're adjusting, still scared. Especially the youngest, Mason. He hides when I enter the room. Walter says it will pass, that children need structure. Ethan calls for his mother at night. Further entries described a strict routine: meals, reading, prayer, outdoor time, rewards and punishments, drawing as therapy, only supervised outdoor play. Owen ran to the fence today. Walter hit him. I told him it was too harsh. He said they needed fear to stay loyal. The last entry was dated July 19th, 1990. The youngest is gone. Walter buried him under the shed. I wanted to leave. Walter said it would be my fault if the others were taken. He said they were his now. Jenkins stopped reading. No one spoke a word, a heavy silence hanging in the air. Eleanor simply sat at the table, staring out the window, her face still, but tears silently streamed down her cheeks, leaving wet trails. In the morning, Jenkins called the sheriff's office. Excavation at the trailer began within hours. Under the shed, they discovered a shallow grave. Inside were the remains of a male child, estimated to be 8 years old. DNA tests would confirm it later, but Eleanor already knew. It was Mason. Ethan and Owen, however, were nowhere to be found. Eleanor stood at the edge of the shallow grave long after the forensics team had finished. The Arizona sun beat down, hot and relentless, but she didn't move. Her hand rested on her chest, her heart pounding beneath her palm. She didn't cry. Not here, not yet. She had cried so much over the years that grief had become an organ, something that lived within her, always quietly humming in the background. Now it screamed. Mason. He was the smallest, the gentlest. He used to sneak around the house early in the morning so as not to wake his brothers. He whispered stories to a stuffed dog he called Captain Barkley and tucked it into bed as if it needed protection. They hadn't been able to protect him. Or maybe, Eleanor thought bitterly, they hadn't tried. She had tried. Back at the motel, the journals lay spread open on the bed, open to the passages Jenkins and Olivia kept rereading. The pages were warped from years of heat and neglect, but Miller's handwriting was clear, almost obsessive. His thoughts ranged from fragmented to reflective and chillingly clinical. They see me as the helper. I bring food. I explain the rules. But Walter is the voice they obey. He calls them the brothers, never by their names again. Says names belong to the past. He keeps them separate now. Says they're less likely to conspire that way. Olivia turned a page, her fingers trembling slightly. Mason won't eat unless I'm there. He cries silently. I think he knows it's coming. Owen tried to fight back yesterday. He threw a toy at Walter. Said, "You're not my dad." Walter locked him in the dark room for 12 hours. A few entries later, the tone shifted. They're older now. Ethan speaks in riddles. Owen looks at me like he knows something I don't. They don't call for help. Haven't in weeks. The silence is worse than the screams. That evening, Detective Jenkins met with local authorities. Forensics confirmed the remains under the shed matched Mason Bennett based on dental records and DNA. The sheriff's department launched a multi-state investigation into Ethan and Owen, assuming they might still be alive or had been moved before Mason's death. Eleanor sat in the motel hallway outside the briefing room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her body trembled, but her face remained calm. They knew he was gone, she whispered when Jenkins returned. Ethan and Owen, they lived with that. For how long? We don't know, Jenkins said softly. But the journals end in 1990. The last entry implies Mason died then. That means the other two were alive for almost a year after the abduction. And after that? Olivia asked from the doorway. Jenkins hesitated. No trace. Not in Arizona. Not in Texas. Nothing. Eleanor shook her head. They're out there. I can feel it. Later that night, Eleanor sat alone with the second journal, flipping through the last pages. One entry was written with such force that the ink bled through the page. He took them somewhere. Said he needed to start fresh. Said the desert was too open. He didn't trust me to follow him. He took the Cadillac. Her breath hitched. She went back to the photographs. The same red Cadillac, visible in the 1989 photo of the boys standing in front of Thompson's house. The same make and model that now sat in a shed in Rosewood County, in a fenced-off area Eleanor was never allowed to enter. By morning, Jenkins had confirmed the vehicle information. "Yes," she said. "The car is still registered to Walter Thompson's estate. It was never impounded, just left in a storage shed near the main house." "Can we search it?" Eleanor asked. "We already did when we reopened the case," Jenkins said. "The garage, at least, but not the shed. We had no reason to break the lock." "You do now," Eleanor said, her eyes hard and resolute. 2 days later, they were back on Maplewood Drive. Eleanor stood in her garden, clutching the envelope with the bracelets in her hand. She hadn't truly been in the backyard of the Thompson house since the boys disappeared. She and Jenkins, joined by local authorities, entered the shed together. Dust motes hung in the air like ghostly lanterns, dancing in the shafts of light. A red Cadillac Eldorado sat in the center, casually covered by a tarp, faded but intact. Jenkins slowly approached, flashlight in one hand. The trunk had been pried open years ago, but no one had looked under the lining. Jake, standing by with a crowbar, stepped forward at Jenkins' signal. He lifted the lining. There was a creak, then silence, then the dull thud of wood against metal. A hidden compartment. Inside, 3 partially burned but legible school IDs. Ethan Bennett, Owen Bennett, Mason Bennett, and beneath them, a small, torn photograph. 2 boys, perhaps 11 years old, standing on a beach, one with a dog, the other holding a book. Eleanor gasped, her hand covering her mouth. "It's them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The photograph was scanned and digitally enhanced. A logo on one boy's T-shirt was traced to a private farm and youth program, founded in 1992 in rural Texas under a new nonprofit name. The founder, Howard Davies, a retired teacher, a former colleague of Walter Thompson at Oak Ridge Elementary School. His name had never come up before. Eleanor felt her knees buckle when she heard it. "I remember him," she said. "He taught science. My boys loved him." Jenkins read the report aloud. Howard Davies resigned abruptly in 1990. Claimed early retirement. No pension transfer. No forwarding address. Olivia's voice was low, almost a whisper. "You think he took them?" Jenkins' face was grim, her gaze serious. "I think Walter gave them to someone he trusted." Eleanor's eyes burned, an indomitable resolve in them. "Then it's time to find him." The nonprofit still existed. The website was minimalist, almost rustic. It described a faith-based agricultural community dedicated to helping at-risk youth find purpose through structure and care. It was called Howard's Haven of Hope. No phone number, just an address and a donation link. Eleanor looked at the photo on the homepage. Smiling boys in overalls, tilling the earth. A man in the background, tall, gray-haired, with a slight smile. "Can we go?" she asked Jenkins. "We can go," Jenkins said. "But we're not going alone." The sun hung low over the Texas plains as Eleanor, Olivia, and Detective Jenkins drove up a gravel road marked by a faded wooden sign, Howard's Haven of Hope, EST 1992. Planting roots, growing lives. The letters were freshly painted, but the gate, however, was old, rusted and manual. It creaked as Jenkins pushed it open. Eleanor's pulse quickened as the car rolled forward. Jake had stayed behind in Rosewood County, too shaken to face what might come next. But Eleanor needed to be here. Her boys might have walked this same road, might have lived in one of the buildings now silhouetted against the dusty horizon. They passed a pasture where boys, mostly teenagers, tilled the earth in long rows. From a distance, it looked wholesome, simple. But Eleanor had lived long enough to know that even silence could wear a mask. Jenkins parked by the main building, a 2-story farmhouse with sun-faded curtains and potted plants on the porch. A woman met them at the door, a clipboard in her hand. "Welcome to the Haven. I'm Sister Ruth." She was in her 60s, short gray hair under a straw sun hat, her voice soft but firm. "Are you here for a tour, or—" "We're here to speak with Mr. Davies," Jenkins said, showing her badge. "Is he on site?" Sister Ruth's smile faltered. "I believe so. He was in the greenhouse earlier, but he might have returned to his residence." Jenkins nodded. "Please inform him that the Rosewood County Police Department has reopened a missing persons case, and we have reason to believe this property is involved." The woman's face paled. "I'll find him." The greenhouse was warm and fragrant, filled with the smell of damp earth and lemon balm. Eleanor entered alone, her gaze sweeping over the seedlings, the hanging pots, the child-painted signs. At the far end, she saw a man, bent over a tray of tomato starts, humming a tune, inaudible, but gentle. He looked up. Gray hair, a wrinkled face, a soft smile, cautious but not unfriendly. "Can I help you?" he asked. Eleanor didn't answer at first. Her throat was tight. His eyes narrowed. "Do I know you?" She stepped forward. "You taught my boys at Oak Ridge Elementary School." He blinked. His hand froze in the dirt. "Ethan, Owen, and Mason Bennett," she said. "They disappeared in 1989. A long pause. "I remember them," he said softly. "Smart boys, gentle, always together." Eleanor studied his face. "What happened to them?" He glanced at the seedlings. "I don't know." She took another step forward. "But Walter Thompson gave them to you." He said nothing. "They were scared when they came. Confused. Walter said their parents had abandoned them, that they needed structure." "They were stolen," Eleanor said. "And you knew it?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't ask questions. I told myself I was helping." "Where are they now?" she demanded. "Where are my sons?" Howard looked up at her. And for the first time, his voice wavered. "I can take you to one of them." They followed him silently to his small house behind the greenhouse, more secluded, well-maintained. Wind chimes jingled in the doorway. Inside was a man in his 30s. Dark curly hair, warm olive skin, a muscular build. He stood at the stove, stirring something in a pan. When he turned, Eleanor's knees buckled. His eyes, his smile. It was Ethan. He looked exactly like her husband, exactly like his 7-year-old self, but grown. "Mom," he whispered. Eleanor stepped forward, trembling. "Ethan." He looked at Howard, then back at her. "I don't remember," he said. "I was told you died, that you were in jail." Eleanor choked back a sob. Jenkins quietly moved to the door, giving them space. Olivia placed a hand on Howard's shoulder. "You took them in," she said. "But you never told them the truth." "I didn't know how," Howard whispered. And then too much time passed. Ethan, who went by Ferdinand, sat with them under the porch awning. He explained everything. "I remember the house," he said. "Maplewood Drive in Brutus, but I thought it was a dream. We were told we were immigrants, that we were rescued." Eleanor slowly nodded. After a long thought, he paused, his throat tight. "We left Thompson's trailer, came here." Jenkins asked softly, "Do you know where Owen is?" Ethan nodded. "He's still on the property. We work in different parts of the program, but there's something else." He hesitated. "There's a third brother, Marco." Eleanor's brows furrowed. "Marco? We're triplets, but we were told he was one of us, that he was a brother." I didn't question it. "He looks like us." Jenkins stood up sharply. "How many young men here look like you?" Ethan replied quietly, 3. Within the hour, Jenkins and local law enforcement had Howard Davies in custody and had secured the property. Owen, who went by Diego, was found in the main office. He froze when he saw Eleanor, but collapsed into her arms as soon as she spoke his name. "I remember your voice," he whispered. Marco was found in a private cabin nearby, watching over a group of younger boys in the garden. He was confused, disoriented, but looked exactly like the others. Eleanor recognized him instantly. Mason's small eyes, Ethan's dimples, Owen's gait. "Gabriel," she said. "Your real name is Gabriel." In the shed, they found a Cadillac, still parked, still clean. In the glove compartment, 3 fake birth certificates, a notepad, and a photograph Eleanor had never seen before. Triplets, no older than 10, sitting by a riverbank, fishing poles in hand, no smiles, just staring, blank and still. They had been lost to the world, but now they were found. Eleanor watched the 3 young men from the motel window. Ethan, Owen, Gabriel. They sat on a bench in silence, shoulder to shoulder, sipping sodas from a vending machine. No one spoke. Sometimes one would glance at the others, but they didn't hold eye contact for long. An invisible thread seemed to connect them, but so much time had passed that none of them knew how to hold it. She placed her palm against the window. She didn't cry. Not yet. Detective Jenkins briefed Eleanor and Olivia that morning. "Howard Davies is in custody. He's confessed to harboring the boys since 1990. Claims Walter Thompson brought them to him after things went wrong at the trailer. He said he was trying to save them from further harm." Olivia scoffed. "He built a lie around them. More than." "It's worse," Jenkins said grimly. "He completely changed their identities. All 3 boys were given fake birth certificates under different names: Ferdinand, Diego, and Gabriel. Ethan had the oldest alias. Gabriel, who replaced Mason, was adopted from another foster child Walter briefly took in before his death. After 1991, there were no legal records of that child's existence. Eleanor's voice trembled. So they replaced my son. Jenkins nodded. It appears Gabriel was too young to remember much, but he grew up with the others. He doesn't know who he is, or who he isn't, Eleanor murmured. The forensics team returned to the old trailer in Arizona. The discovery of Mason's grave led to a wider excavation around that area. Soil samples, partial remains, long-decayed bones were found. By the end of the week, they had uncovered items clearly belonging to other children, a shoelace bracelet, a melted action figure, a small denim jacket with the name Cody embroidered on the tag. This goes deeper than just your boys, Jenkins told Eleanor. We believe there were others, not taken together, but hidden in the same way, abandoned, replaced, with altered identities. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. How many? We don't know yet, but we will. The next morning, Eleanor met with Gabriel alone. They sat in a park near the motel under a pecan tree. She brought him a lemonade, but he barely touched it. I don't know what you want from me, Gabriel said softly. Eleanor looked at him, her voice calm. I don't want anything you don't want to give. He stared at the grass. They say I'm not Mason, but I look like them. I feel like I belong to them. Doesn't that make it true? She reached into her purse and pulled out the 3 bracelets. She gently placed them on the bench between them. These were theirs, she said. I found them in a box, hidden under the floor in a room no one knew existed. Gabriel looked at the bracelets. Small, colorful, innocent. I wore one like that, he said. It said Gabe on it. Eleanor nodded. That's your name now, but it wasn't always. He was silent for a long time. Can I keep them then? She nodded. Keep all 3. Ethan sat with Olivia that evening in the motel lobby. He had asked for her specifically, not his mother, not yet. I need to understand something, he said. Were we famous? Olivia hesitated. You were remembered. That's not the same. No, it's not. But your faces were in the papers, on milk cartons. For years, Ethan exhaled, and no one ever found us. You were carefully hidden. You were given new names, new birthdays, new parents, people who buried you inside a news story. Ethan looked up. So who am I now? She gave the only answer that felt honest. Whoever you want to be? He thought for a long time, then said, Ethan. Owen found Eleanor in the motel courtyard. She was watering a hanging basket of wilting flowers, old habits returning to her. I remember your laugh, he said. It used to shake the whole kitchen. Eleanor slowly turned. And I remember yours, she said. It always followed Ethan's, like an echo. He nodded. I didn't forget you. I never stopped looking for you. They stood in silence, not needing more words. She held out the watering can, and he took it. Gabriel underwent a voluntary DNA test. The results came back. No biological relation to the Bennett family. The news broke him. I don't know who I am, he whispered to Jenkins. I was Mason. Now I'm no one. Eleanor walked over quietly. But you were loved by Ethan and Owen. You were raised as a brother. That makes you mine in all the ways that matter. He cried for the first time, and she didn't stop him. The forensics team released a full report on the activities of Walter Thompson and Howard Davies. At least 5 sets of unidentified child remains were found across 2 locations, along with a documented network of forged documents and movements, possibly extending to other states. Miller's journals confirmed at least 3 other movements, identities never established. Davies pleaded guilty to conspiracy, unlawful detention of minors, and obstruction of justice. He would likely die in prison. Eleanor did not attend the sentencing. Let him disappear, she said. Let him rot nameless. A month later, Ethan, Owen, and Gabriel moved into a rented house together near Rosewood County. They didn't talk much about the past, not yet. But Eleanor visited them every Sunday. She brought food, sometimes photos, sometimes just silence. All of it was accepted. Gabriel began using his birth name again, Cody. Jenkins had found a long-lost birth certificate, buried in the Texas foster care system. Cody had been briefly fostered by Walter Thompson as an infant, then disappeared. Now he was real again. Eleanor stood in her garden again, digging in the dirt with gloved hands. She planted 3 lilies, for Ethan, for Owen, for Mason. Cody stood beside her, holding the watering can. I think I want to be a teacher, he said. She looked up, surprised. He smiled. I want to help kids feel safe, like I never did. Eleanor nodded. That would be the best thing you could do. And together, they watered the roots. The last time Eleanor had flown on a plane, it was for a funeral. This time, The plane climbed into a golden sky as she sat between Olivia and Detective Jenkins. Her hands gripped a paper cup of water tightly, her fingers trembling slightly. They weren't returning to Rosewood County just yet. Arizona still held one more name, one more unfinished thread, and Jenkins refused to leave it hanging. It was Ralph Miller. Though Howard Davies had fully cooperated in exchange for a lighter sentence, he had only vague details about Miller's last movements. He left after Thompson died, took one boy with him, the quiet one. I assumed it was Ethan, but I never saw him again. Records had traced Miller to a P.O. box in northern Arizona. For a long time, the trail was cold, until a recent property transaction surfaced under one of Miller's old aliases, Harold Moss, a 20-acre plot outside a ghost town called Canyon Ridge. The place was remote, unregistered, and fenced off. Jenkins called it the last known shadow. They drove through desolate highways and sun-bleached rock formations. The further they went, the less the GPS could help. Cell service dropped, the road narrowed to dirt. Maybe it's just an old shack, Olivia said from the passenger seat, trying to find some explanation. A dead end, she added. Eleanor said nothing, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she saw something others couldn't. It was almost dusk when they reached the compound. It looked untouched, as if time had abandoned it. A rusty trailer, a small shed, a satellite dish hanging by a thread. A man sat on the porch, legs stretched out, hands resting on his knees. He stood as the car approached, thin, with a gray beard, eyes like steel marbles. Jenkins got out first. Ralph Miller. The man didn't flinch. Depends on who's asking. I'm Detective Sarah Jenkins. This is Eleanor Bennett. He looked at Eleanor, his jaw twitching. Bennett, he said softly, as if tasting the name. Eleanor stepped forward. You knew my sons, she said, her voice firm. He didn't deny it. I knew a lot of boys, he said. Some were louder than others. They sat around a scratched wooden table inside the trailer. The air smelled of dust, tobacco, and old metal. A fan whirred in the corner, but it did little to combat the heat. I didn't hurt them, Miller said indifferently. That was Thompson. I just kept them alive. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. You abducted them. I protected them from a worse fate. You hid them from their mother. He looked at her, his gaze piercing. And what would you have done if you knew the truth? How would the world have treated 3 boys who forgot how to speak, who no longer knew their last name? Eleanor's voice didn't rise, but it held a steely resolve. I would have tried, she said. I would have loved them. Miller turned away. Jenkins slid a photograph across the table, the shot from the youth camp. Ethan and Owen sat side by side. This one, she said. You took him. You took Owen. Miller's lip twitched. He wouldn't stop screaming, he said. Even after Mason died. Hale told me to silence him, but I ran. I took him, trying to give him a new life. You gave him a lie, Eleanor said. Miller turned to her. And yet, he's alive. In the shed, they found records, names, dates, forged documents, but more importantly, they found a box of drawings, crayon scribbles on aged paper, a dog, a house, a boy with a balloon, all signed. Oh, Bennett, age 9. Eleanor clutched them to her chest like scripture. Why did you keep these? Olivia asked Miller later. I had to remember something, he said. Not everything I did was evil. Jenkins stood. You'll be charged, she said, with aiding and abetting abduction, unlawful detention, and obstruction of justice. Miller nodded. I figured. Why didn't you run? She asked. He looked out the window. I already ran. 30 years ago. Been waiting for the knock ever since. Eleanor returned to the motel with Jenkins and Olivia. She spread the drawings on the bed. Soon, Owen arrived. He had insisted on coming, wanted to see for himself what Miller had kept. He walked into the room, saw the drawings, and froze. His hand went to his mouth. I drew these, he whispered. I remember the dog. I named him Spanner. Eleanor took his hand. You were never forgotten, she said, even by those who didn't deserve to remember you. Owen hugged her. This time, she let the tears flow, freely and silently. The next morning, the 4 of them sat outside the motel, sipping bad coffee and watching the sunrise. Jenkins spoke first. There's another grave near the trailer. The bones are still being tested. Eleanor didn't flinch. I'm ready for what we find, she said. But I know who I have now, Olivia added softly. And you're not alone in this anymore. Cody arrived an hour later, having driven all night from Rosewood County. Ethan did too. The triplets, though different now, sat together for the first time, fully understanding who they were and who they weren't. I don't remember everything, Ethan said. You don't have to, Eleanor replied. What matters is you're here. The garden on Maplewood Drive was alive again, filled with new hope. She had told herself year after year that if the truth was buried anywhere, it was buried deep. And the town, it seemed, was ready to bury it with her. The streets of Maplewood Drive, once filled with children's laughter, now echoed only with emptiness. Neighbors averted their eyes, words of comfort turned to whispers, then vanished altogether. Eleanor was left alone with her grief, with questions no one dared to ask, and with a silence that was louder than any scream. Every day was a reminder of what was lost and what was never found. The house, once filled with life, became a temple of waiting, a place where time had stopped on that fateful day. For 34 years, she lived in that frozen moment, clinging to the ghostly hope that one day the veil of mystery would lift. She knew that the truth, however bitter, was the only path to peace. But when a young couple, renovating a house 2 doors down, discovered a rusty red lunchbox with Owen's name scratched on the lid, time collapsed like a camera shutter. The world Eleanor had built around her grief crumbled in an instant. No longer was she merely a grieving mother, locked in her silence. She became a witness. And someone, somewhere, had always known the truth. This discovery, seemingly insignificant, became the spark that ignited a long smoldering fire. She felt old wounds, which had seemed to heal, reopen, but this time not to bleed, but to release trapped energy. Years of waiting were over. Now it was time to act, to search, to demand answers.